Hello everyone, I am Sohil Ansari, currently studying in MSRIT Bangalore in Information Science and Engineering Department. Our team is named Pitaguri and my team members are Vinay, Prakash Uttar and Yashwadan Pandey. Our team decided to address the topic of how GDP of each Indian state affect the dropout rate in the country. So, as the Indian economy is characterized by the diverse mix of economic activities related to agriculture sector, industrial sector and the service sector. Alternatively, from an economic point of view, the Indian economy can be broadly composed into three major sectors, namely primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector, that are commonly known as agriculture sector, industrial sector, and service sector respectively. The present research study is aimed at analyzing and comparing the data with regard to the contribution of the major sector of Indian economy, that is agriculture sector, industrial sector, and service sector, in the overall GDP of a country during the period 2011 to 2017 and determine if they affect the dropout rate. For this particular topic, our team researched on various related journal papers to gain deep insight of topics. We basically use the four literature surveys, which the first one is basically written by the Dr. Konda Hari Prasad Reddy in his paper, that is analysis and comparison of overall GDP depending only on the three major sector in Indian economy, showed that the present study is an attempt to analyze and compare the contribution of three major sectors. Second literature survey we basically do that is written by the Dr. V. Suthasini M. Balagita in his paper. M. Balagita in his paper, an economic analysis of sector-wise contribution to GDP in India, showed the analysis of sectorial contribution in India in these 20 years shows that agriculture sector contribution. Third, we basically use the journal or the paper written by the Dheeraj Jain, K. Sanal Nair, and Vaishali Jain. In his paper, the factor affecting GDP on various factors such as manufacturing, services, industry, he found that the variable which affect the growth of GDP components were FDI, net FII equity, net FII debt, import, export. And the last literature survey we basically do on the research paper that was written by the Pallavi Chaith, Shekel Munjal, Dr. Gurcharan Singh. In his in their journal paper, which was named as an empirical study of GDP in Indian economy on inflation and population, concluded that the outcome of the research study is that the population is found as significantly influential for the GDP. Now, moving forward to our problem statement. Problem statement. Problem statement. We basically focus on the two things: that which sector contribute to state GDP, and does the education dropout rate affect the GDP or not. So for this, we use the data pre-processing. In data pre-processing, we basically use the study which is based on the secondary data obtained from the data.gov.in website. This study uses the annual time series data cover from 2011 to 2017. GDP at factor cost was taken for economic growth, as this study examines the contribution of agriculture sector, industrial sector, and service sector to the GDP in India. Further, moving toward the data pre-processing, we we basically uses the data frame that calculated the GDP and GDP percentage as shown in the screen. We basically remove the additional spaces in the state name by using the code as shown in this line. We basically we basically uses the Union Territory, Andaman Nicobar, Chandigarh, Delhi, and Pondicherry, and we check that there are missing values or not, because missing values basically affect our result. So we maintain the data frame whether we have the missing value or not. Now now then we have the data set in which we have the which have the dimension of 11 into 31, in which the missing list data is basically 56, and there are zero duplicate values. We uses the duration for the years 2011 to 2017, and we calculated the missing values. Then we basically these are basically the details of GDP and GDP percentage for various state for each of the state. These are basically the data sets, the data frame of each of explaining of each of the data uh, of each of the GDP and GDP percentage. Then we basically calculated the missing calculated and remove calculated missing values. We find the missing values and then we remove the missing value by using these code. Then by these by then we basically merging the details of each state merging the details of each state into the single data frame by the above code, that is pd.concat. And now uh, since uh, uh, since Andaman, Nicobar, Chandigarh, Delhi, and Pondicherry are the union territories, and they affect the state analysis. So we basically drop these union territory in order to get the better result. And then we calculated the and then we basically shows the information of all the state and what are the how the primary sectors such as agriculture, forestry, fishing, mining and quarrying, manufacturing contribute to the GDP of each of the state of our country. We calculated all these values. Then we calculate primary sector contribution, upper primary sector contribution, secondary sector contribution, senior secondary contribution of each state for of each state for the year 2011 to 2017. And these are the values. These are basically the values of GDP and GDP percentage. Then we basically and then we also since the level of education we basically rename our level of education column to that of a state as shown in the screen. That and we calculated the primary we calculated how the primary sector, upper primary sector, and the secondary sector for the year 2014 to 2015 contribute to GDP of a country for each of the state. Then we calculated all these values, and we remove out all the union territories because it ultimately affect our state analysis. Then mm, mm, uh, from the merging of the state into the from the merging of details of each state into the single data frame, we observe that the before the merging, the shape of the state category, the shape of the state category is basically 20 is basically the 28 is to 28 into 29, and the shape of the dropout before the merge is basically 29 is 29 into 4, and the shape of new data frame after the merge is 28 into 32. Then again after dropping out all the union territories value and removing all the nan values, we calculate the GDP. We calculate how the primary sector, secondary sector, and the tertiary sector contribute to the GDP for each state. And then we basically uses the summary statistics that how what are the mean value, what are the median value for what are the mean and the median value for for what are the mean and the median value, and then we calculate the bar plot. Then we basically calculate the bar. We will basically calculate the mean median of GSDP, that is that is GDP percentage per capita, and this graph basically depicts that which state fall under GSDP per capita interval, and we calculated and this bar table basically gives the information of the contribution of primary sector, secondary, upper primary sector and secondary sector for the year 2014 to 2015, in which some man value is present. Hmm. So from this graph, it is quite clear. From this table, it is quite clear that for the primary sector, for each of the state, the average of each of the basically the for each state, the average count is 26.0 for the primary sector. For the upper primary sector, it is 27.0, and for the secondary sector, it is 29.0. Similarly, the mean is 5.15, 4.52, and 17.76. Similarly, the standard deviation minimum and the maximum. We calculated the primary. We calculated the mean. That is for the year 2014 to 2015, which is average for each of the state. Each of the 28 state. Similarly, for the upper primary, secondary, and then we calculate the median for the primary, upper primary, secondary. Then we calculated the bar graph here as follows. After all the pre-processing and removing the nan values, removing the nan values, removing the union territories, removing the union territories, we make the line plots and the bar plots. Whose code is this? Line plot, we basically for our. So here is the result that we obtained from the above code is the percentage growth of previous year for the state Andhra Pradesh. So what we do is basically we calculate the percentage growth over previous year for each of the state. So so first one is for the Andhra Pradesh, similarly for the Arunachal Pradesh. Here we can see that the blue line represent the state growth percentage, that is this, and the all India growth percentage is represented by the orange line. So we can make the comparison. So we can draw out the comparison from for the particular state with the all India growth percentage. Similarly, we calculate the percentage growth for the Assam, Bihar, Goa, Chhattisgarh, etc. for each of the state. These are basically the line plots. Similarly, we make the bar plots and bar plots where we take the duration in the y-axis and the percentage in the x-axis. This bar plot also calculates the percentage growth over the previous year for each of the state. For example, here we take the Andhra Pradesh and here the Arunachal Pradesh. Arunachal Pradesh, similarly for the Assam, Bihar, and for similarly for each of the states. In each of the states. So, what we observe from the above line plot and the bar plot is that there is a negative trend in the percentage growth of GDP of India, which can be seen from the above plot. We take the data. We take the data of percentage for the year 2012 to 2013 till 2016 to 2017. We take the following observation. First is Andhra Pradesh, Assam, Goa, Jammu Kashmir, Manipur, Telangana, Tripura, Meghalaya state have a continuous trend in increase in growth percentage over the years. Out of this, Goa has the highest value of positive slope. Similarly, the Goa, Manipur, Andhra Pradesh have the highest trend of continuous increase in the percentage growth of GDP. Similarly, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, Odisha are the three states with a continuous low performing trend with respect to the growth percentage of the state in GDP. Now, then we calculate the percentage average growth of each state over the years. Over the year, that is for the year 2012 to 2013. Similarly, for the 2013 2013 to 2014 till 2016 to 2017. We calculate the average growth percentage for each of the year, and we calculate the average growth. For example, for the Mizoram it is 16.87, for the Nagaland it is 15.95, and we calculated the bar chart of thing for the average growth percentage for each of the state for the previous year. For example, the Mizoram, we can see from the screen it is Mizoram, Nagaland, Tripura, Madhya Pradesh, and similarly for each of the state. And we, from the above bar chart, it is quite clear that for the state Punjab, Jammu Kashmir, Odisha, Sikkim, and Meghalaya, and Goa have the GDP growth percentage lower than the national GDP growth for the year 2012 to 2017. From the bar chart, it is quite clear. Then we find the leading contributor to the state GDP, and for this we basically find the total GDP for each state using the formula that is given by the total GSP is equal to primary plus secondary per tertiary contribution, and the GSDP, and that is the GDP percentage is equal to total GSPA plus tax on product minus subsidies on the product. As we can see from the above table, that is this table, we have the union territories which have to be removed in order to get the better state analysis. And then similarly we uses the bar chart thing to find the leading contributor to the state GDP. We basically consider the year 2014-2015. This is basically the bar chart. From the bar chart, it is quite clear that Goa is basically the major contributor to the state GDP, and Bihar is the least. Then we we basically use some additional values to the data set, which are basically the percentage of primary sector on GSDP, percentage of tertiary sector on GDP percentage of taxes on GDP percentage of subsidies on GDP percentage, and the factors which basically contributed to the primary, secondary and tertiary, and the values for each state are basically given by these basically given by this table. This bar graph or the bar chart is basically the whole of our summary for this project. This bar chart basically defines or depicts the percentage contribution of sector towards the GDP. The blue is basically the primary percentage, the orange is basically the secondary percentage, and the green is basically the tertiary percentage. And for each state, it basically depicted in the following way as shown in the screen. Now, the third and the important factor that we consider is the impact of education dropout rate on the GSDP. For this, we basically calculate the heat map for the primary, upper primary, secondary, and the per capita GSDP by using the following code. We basically consider for the year 2014 to 2015. From the above heat map, we basically found that the dropout rate of the primary education level is negative correlated to the secondary sector percentage contribution. Dropout rate of primary education level is negative correlated with secondary sector percentage contribution, and the dropout rate of upper secondary education level is negative correlated with the secondary sector percent contribution. We uses the hypothesis testing for the above dropout rate and the sector percentage contribution in population. We use the hypothesis testing because of the increase in the dropout rate negatively, because increase in the dropout rate negatively affect the secondary sector and thereby GDP of the state with major percentage contribution from the secondary sector. And secondly, the government must bring in measure to control the dropout rate, which will help in increase the GDP of a state. So for these two reasons, we uses the hypothesis testing. We basically uses the three hypothesis testing. First, the Pearson correlation testing. The second, the Spearman's rank correlation testing, and the third is Kendall's rank correlation testing. In each test, we use the various GDP parameters such as the per capita, GSDP, or the primary or secondary percentage. For example, for the first test, Pearson correlation test, we uses the GDP parameter. First GDP parameter is the per capita GSDP, and here the education parameter is basically the primary, and which is dependent and having the p-value of 0.0109. Similarly, we calculated the parameter. Similarly, we calculated the various GDP parameter, GDP parameters such as primary percentage, secondary percentage, where the education parameter is basically the primary for the year 2014 to 2015, and the result that basically comes out is dependent. Similarly, for the secondary percentage for the year 2014 and 2015, primary one is basically dependent, and for the upper primary one, it is 2014 to 2015. Similarly, we perform the Spearman's rank correlation test, and we calculated the various GDP. We get the result related to the various GDP parameter, such as various GDP parameters such as per capita primary percentage and secondary percentage, and we obtain the value such as dependent such as the dependent and for each of the test we get the result as the dependent as shown on the screen. Similarly, for the Kendall's rank correlation test, we uses the parameters such as per capita, primary percentage, and secondary percentage, and for each of the values for the year 2014 to 2015, we get the result dependent. From the above, and then we uses the once we get the hypothesis testing, then we basically uses the regression model in order to build we uses the various machine learning models such as the linear regression model and the k-means clustering. First of all, we uses the regression model to build our uh, to build a model on our data. So our data is basically for each state. The primary for the 2020 to 2013, and 2013 to 2014, 2014 to 2015. And this table shows the data for each of the state for the year 2012 to 2015 for the primary sector contribution. So primary sector contribution. Now, these are basically our analysis and we use the code for building our model. Then we uses the GSDP per capita and dropout rate for each of the state. Then we basically build our model, and that is a linear regression model. Linear regression model, and if we have the slope of from the code and from our data, we infer that our slope is basically this minus 2.4 and intercept is 46.9, and having the equation of linear model is this, and the root mean square is 3.676, and we get the value, and we get the graph is as follows. This is our first machine learning model. Then we uses the another regression model, that is a k-means clustering. K-means clustering. For this, we calculated per capita GSDP and the primary sector contribution for the year 2014 to 2015. Then we build our model with the help of code with the help of this code, and from the data and our model we inferred, we basically get this graph. We sort the value on the basis of the cluster, and we found that we found that some of the states such as Andhra Pradesh, Tripura, Rajasthan, Odisha, etc. belongs to one cluster. Haryana, Gujarat, Uttarakhand belongs to one cluster, and Goa, Sikkim belongs to one cluster. Now, from the above. From the above data analysis, from the above analysis of GDP, of how the various sector, that is primary, secondary, and tertiary, affect the GDP. We conclude that we basically summarize that the GDP per capita of each of the state is affected by the education dropout rate in the primary, upper primary, uh, upper primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary percentage is affected by the education dropout. For the education dropout rate in the primary, upper primary, in the upper primary and secondary, then and the third conclusion we basically derive from the above analysis is the secondary percentage, that is secondary sector GDP upon the total GDP is basically affected by the education dropout rate in the primary and the upper primary sector, which is one of the which is one of the important contribution to our GDP. So this is all from our side related to the problem statement, that how the GDP, that how the various factors such as the primary sector, secondary sector, and the tertiary sector contributed or affect to our GDP. Thank you.